Hello everyone, hope you've all had a good new year. Today we're taking a look back at the Radeon HD 4550 from AMD. It came in variants of 512MB and 256MB of DDR2 memory on a 64-bit wide bus, but today we're working with the 256MB version from MSI. The 3450, with a core clock of 600MHz and a memory clock of 500MHz, which is effectively 1000MHz due to the nature of DDR2, released in January of 2008 with a TDP of only 25 watts, and used the RV620 GPU, the RV620 LE variant specifically. It used the terascale architecture and featured 181 million transistors built on the 55nm fabrication process, and came packing 2 compute units, 40 shading units, 4 raster operations pipelines, and 4 texture mapping units. And given that it is fairly old by today's standards, the 3450 won't support the latest games, but it does carry support for DirectX 10.1 and OpenGL 3.3, and requires a monitor that supports DVI, VGA or S-Video connections, unless you have an adapter. Originally, the 3450 released at a price of $49 which today, adjusting for inflation, is around $57, or around £45 or €52 today. You can, however, pick it up much more cheaply today, as I'm sure you can imagine, from CEX here in the UK for as little as £4 when it is in stock, and on eBay in America you can buy it for around $7 with free postage and packaging. The rest of the system I'll be using today features an i7 6700K at 4.8 GHz. This eliminates any bottlenecks in performance other than the 3450 itself. An MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard, 16GB of Corsir Vengeance DDR4 RAM at 2800MHz, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. First up, I thought I'd put the 3450 through Unigine Heaven 4.0, as I wanted to get an idea of its benchmarking performance rather than just run it through a few games only. I decided to use the basic preset within Unigine Heaven, and I also changed it to run at full screen as well. At the factory stock 600MHz core clock and 500MHz memory clock, the 3450 managed a score of only 71 points, far below what even the budget cards of today can manage. Overclocking wise, I managed to get another 155MHz out of the core, and 145MHz out of the memory, for an overclock of 755MHz on the core and 645MHz on the memory. At this speed, the HD 3450 managed almost 30% greater performance with a score of 88. Normally, I like to start the tests off with Grand Theft Auto 5, which had its much anticipated PC release back in 2015, and is still a great game for benchmarking today due to how popular it still is. Unfortunately though, the game was completely unplayable. It was genuinely one of the worst performers in the history of my channel. Due to the HD 3450 being a budget card even when it was released 11 years ago, I decided to run the game at the lowest resolution possible, 800 by 600 with 50% frame scaling, meaning that the game is effectively rendering at only 400 by 300. Despite this, as I said, the game was totally unplayable. FPS in the city was between 10 to 17 frames per second, and the game showed some pretty severe input lag and input locking as well. The input locking, which is kind of like, say, when the throttle or steering sticks on a car, was so severe that I gave up on running any kind of benchmark due to how bad it was. I was really hoping for something at least resembling a playable game, and with Csgo I sort of got that to an extent. I also ran this at the lowest settings and resolution I could, 640 by 480, and I ran the test in a competitive hard difficulty bot match on the Mirage map. FPS tended to be around the high 30s to the high 50s throughout the test, and seemed to run smoothly at times, although it did suffer from some pretty noticeable stuttering occasionally, and the combat was also quite difficult at times as well. A Fraps Benchmark showed an average of 49 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 27 and 24 frames per second respectively. There were also some gaps between some of the frames of around 70 to 100 milliseconds. Overall, it was mostly playable, however you may want to think twice about going online, as the stuttering and sometimes difficult combat will definitely affect your experience against real people in the game. Another game that is still pretty popular today is Skyrim. Specifically, I'm testing the original version of the game from 2011, and not the remastered version released in 2016. And like the previous two games, I turned the settings and resolution right down to the low preset at 800 by 600, and also I disabled depth of field through the game's INI file. And given the game's age, I was kind of surprised it didn't perform better than it did. Although, in saying that, I'm forgetting that the HD 3450 was never really meant for gaming, even on its initial release 11 years ago now. The game only managed around 20 to 30 frames per second on the walk to Riverwood, and as you've probably noticed by now, there was also a weird issue with the textures flickering like crazy throughout the game, and trust me, it's not the 3450 artifacting. The game is also quite noticeably micro-stuttering at times, and occasionally drops below 20 frames per second as well. Another issue I noticed was that there was some input lag with the mouse, which didn't affect the test too much, but was definitely still noticeable. Inside Bleak Falls Temple, I also had issues with the textures for cobwebs not rendering at all, leading you to wonder why on earth you can't get through the door to fight the giant spider, for example. The Fraps Benchmark showed an average of 30 frames per second, with 14 and 10 frames per second for its 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, with gaps between some of the frames as bad as 280 milliseconds being observed in the frame time graph. And lastly, before I start overclocking the card, it's Warframe, which is a personal favourite of mine and had its initial release back in 2013. And like Skyrim, I ran Warframe at 800 by 600 with the lowest settings preset I could, and I ran the test in their survival mission on Jupiter. Unfortunately, the game was beyond unplayable. There was a very noticeable amount of input lag, which had a big effect on the gameplay, and in intense scenes with lots of enemies, there was a noticeable slowdown in the game, with a massive reduction in weapon fire rate happening too. FPS throughout was no higher than 22 frames per second and dropped as low as 12 in the most intense scenes. The Fraps Benchmark showed an average of only 18 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 12 and 10 frames per second respectively, with gaps between some of the frames of 100 milliseconds and over occurring throughout the whole test. Moving on to overclocking, and I was actually quite surprised how far I was able to push it. As I mentioned during the Unigine Heaven test earlier, the HD 3450 managed 755 MHz on the core, with 645 MHz on the memory, and that is without an increase in voltage, as the 3450 doesn't have voltage control at all. Both Csgo and Warframe were okay with this as well, and ran perfectly stable, but Grand Theft Auto 5 and Skyrim unfortunately couldn't cope with it. They did, however, manage 730 and 735 MHz on the core respectively, with the same 645 MHz memory overclock. With GTA 5, any improvement over what it managed at stock would be a good thing. The game, though, is unfortunately still pretty unplayable, but I was at least able to run a benchmark this time. FPS was still in the low 10s to around 20 frames per second in the city. It did, however, still stutter quite noticeably. The input lag was also much less as well. That, though, was still pretty significant at times, and I almost gave up on the benchmark due to how it affected the playability of some of the missions. Moving out to the desert area, around where Trevor lives, there was also some noticeable input locking here as well, although it wasn't so bad that I couldn't get around. That aside though, the FPS here was below 20 frames per second, making the game pretty unplayable due to how jarring an experience it is. The Fraps Benchmark showed an average of 19 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 11 and 8 frames per second respectively. There were also multiple gaps between some of the frames of around 100 milliseconds up to 280 milliseconds at its worst according to the frame time graph. With Csgo, there was a pretty significant improvement in performance. Whereas at stock, there was noticeable micro-stutter throughout. The overclock has the game running reasonably smooth. Combat is also much easier as well, which makes the game so much more playable than it was without the overclock. FPS tended to sit around the low 40s to the low 80s, but indoors it would often creep up to around 100 frames per second, which is awesome for such a low-powered card, if you put to one side how low the resolution is. The Fraps Benchmark showed an average of 61 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 31 and 27 frames per second respectively. There were, however, still a number of dips below 30 frames per second according to the frame time graph, but these fortunately weren't noticeable at all during my test. With Skyrim, the overclock did nothing to fix the texture flickering issue I saw at stock clocks, although I wasn't expecting any change there anyway. The overclock, however, did have a pretty significant impact on performance at times. The walk towards Riverwood near the start of the game has FPS figures in the mid-30s to the low 40s, although this drops to around the low to high 20s once you head into the Riverwood Trader. It's still fairly easy to move around here though. Once you get into Bleak Falls Temple, the performance can get pretty bad. FPS sits in the low 20s at points, and there's also some pretty noticeable stutter here too. The issue with the cobweb textures not rendering at all remains here as well. The Fraps Benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 35, 17 and 13 frames per second respectively, with the frame time graph showing some pretty significant gaps between some of the frames of around 100 to 260 milliseconds. With Warframe, given that it is one of my favourite games right now, I was rooting for the overclock to give it a massive improvement. And at first, things did seem pretty hopeful. That didn't last though, as the performance throughout the mission was pretty horrible at times. FPS managed to get around the 30 frames per second mark, but the game was unfortunately still really stuttery and dipped below 15 frames per second at the worst of times, with a very significant and noticeable slowdown in the game being observed much like its stock clocks. The Fraps Benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 24, 15 and 14 frames per second respectively, with gaps between some of the frames of around 60 to 80 milliseconds happening throughout the whole test. Overall, I was a bit disappointed how the HD 3450 performed. It was never intended for gaming, even when it was released 11 years ago, but I at least expected close to playable performance at the resolution I tested the games at, which GTA 5, Skyrim and Warframe just could not offer. Saying that though, with an overclock, Csgo was actually quite enjoyable if you're happy to use 640 by 480. There's just something about really low power graphics cards and processors I like, so I still had a good time testing the HD 3450 regardless of how it performed. If you liked this video, please consider liking it and maybe even leaving a comment as well. I'd also really appreciate it if you could share this with people who you think may enjoy it too. I'd also be eternally grateful if you subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this. So thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.